Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава!
Can do better than that. Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава!
Slava Ukraini!
Heroям слава!
Before I start today's proceedings, exactly, death to the enemies. Before I start today's proceedings, I'd like to say a big thank you to the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain, and particularly the chair, who came nice and early today to help me to get everything set up. Vlodko Pavuk for hosting today. They work tirelessly to support and promote Ukrainian culture, which, as we all know, is being threatened by Russia on a daily basis. Also, a little bit about Support Ukraine, who've been sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine since 2014 and holding protests or rallies in London also since 2014. That's a reminder that Russia's war on Ukraine didn't begin 3 years ago, but it's been going since 2014. We gather on Wednesdays, 6 till 8 o'clock, and on Sundays, 3 till 5. Obviously not this Sunday because of Easter. And so to tonight's event. We'll be talking about the future of European defence, starting with Ukraine. Today, we stand at a defining moment for Europe. The war is not just a tragedy for one nation, it's a wake-up call for the entire continent. Ukraine's courage has reminded us that peace is not a given and that freedom must be protected, not just promised. The dictator Vladimir Putin wanted more than just to seize territory when he began his full-scale invasion 3 years ago. He wanted to send a clear message to the world that the old rules of sovereignty, of human rights, of international law no longer apply, that treaties can be torn up, that civilians are fair targets, that abduction and cultural erasure are tools of power. And we've seen what that looks like. In city after city across Ukraine, Russian forces have built torture chambers, kidnapped children, and erased their identities. They've targeted journalists, artists, and teachers, not by accident, but by design. Why? Because they represent truth, culture, and memory. And as we know, these are the lifeblood of any democracy. Ukraine is not only defending its territory, it's defending the very principles on which our European peace and unity were built. The struggle is a mirror held to us all. The future of European defence must be rooted in unity, resilience, and strategic independence. Investing in defence is no longer optional, it is essential. The future of European defence begins today, and it begins with our support for Ukraine. Tonight's event is raising funds for Leleka, which currently works on projects that are focused on first aid and evacuation of war casualties in Ukraine, primarily on the front line. So thank you for everybody that's donated tonight by donating for a ticket. Most recently, Leleka were involved and supported with medical supplies in Sumy after Russia's brutal attack. And now to the panel. The moderator is Jonathan Fink, the presenter of Silicon Curtain. His channel has the who's who of experts on Ukraine. And the expert panelists. We have Edward Hunter Christie, Francis Dearnley, and Cormac Smith. And let's start with a round of applause, please, for all present. And with that, I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Thomas. What a fantastic introduction. And I'm very, very grateful to everybody who's come out this evening, especially given that it's bank holiday, it's Good Friday, and immensely grateful to everyone on the panel also for putting aside social occasions, etc., to come here and do this. It's incredibly important. We also very much hope that the online audience will be seeing this, hopefully tomorrow night when I've managed to edit it all up, that we'll get a substantial online audience for the important topics that are being discussed here. The format is going to be me firing questions at our expert panel. But before we do that, I'm going to ask each to do a short introduction to themselves. And if they want, they can also do a short couple of minutes on why Europe is at risk and why it's important that we meet today. If they don't want to do a little introduction there, then that's fine, and we'll move on. We have Francis Dearnley, who is one of the UK's leading journalists and co-host of Ukraine the Latest, which is the most popular and I would say most impactful global podcast, broadcasting daily on the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. We have Cormac Smith, who you will come to hear is a very strong and passionate voice for Ukraine. He is also in the unique position that he has had experience of working with government ministers in Ukraine on secondment from the British civil service. That is an absolutely unique position to understand not only the Ukrainian culture and mindset, but also how the gears of the administration work. Absolutely critical understanding at this time. And we have Edward Hunter Christie, who is an academic, researcher, a geopolitical expert. Many of you I know will follow him on Twitter and other platforms where he is one of the most powerful and insightful voices advocating for Ukrainian victory, but because of his long experience working with NATO and in other capacities, he brings to it an expert knowledge of this area, which I think is sorely lacking from certain quarters. This is our fantastic panel. We will start this way. If anyone wants to add anything to those introductions or to say a couple of words about European security and the UK's role in that, we'll have these little introductions and then we'll jump into the questions. It should last about an hour, and then we will have a chance for a Q&A. Probably that can't extend too late, but we'll and try to keep your questions succinct rather than making speeches. Speechifying will not be tolerated, but hopefully we'll have a sort of good Q&A session. Francis, have you any words to add to that introduction?
Oh, well, it's very generous of you to say the things that you said, and thank you all very much for coming. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to some of you afterwards. Just in terms of our work, as you say, we've been covering the war for Ukraine the Latest, Telegraph podcast, every weekday since the full-scale invasion, including bank holidays. So there is an episode today, although it's a special episode of a panel that my colleague Dom Nichols did in Oxford, reflecting on some of the similar issues that we're talking about this evening, actually, though I think our panel will be better. In terms of further remarks, I mean, there's so many different ways that one can approach this. I think probably I've thought for a very long time that this was always going to be Europe's war to determine, and I could never quite understand why there was so much reluctance in Europe to not only plan for a Trump presidency, because this outcome that we're seeing at the moment was entirely predictable, I would argue, but also, I think, a failure to think about what the ramifications would have been if Kamala Harris had won. Because I think one could argue that actually, even if Harris had won, we'd still be in a very deep conundrum even now, which is underappreciated. We would only, I think, have seen a similar level of support than what we saw under the Biden administration, possibly less. And so we would still have ended up in a situation where Europe would be the determinant factor of how this war ends. And one of the fundamental issues that worries me is that still, 3 years into this war, leaders in Europe are unable to articulate what they want to achieve in this war, what they want the end game to be. So all of these conversations about the coalition of the willing, which, don't get me wrong, I think are vitally important and quite positive in some ways, I'd say that's step 2 for what should be the step 1, which is defining what we want to achieve. Is it a military defeat for the Russians? Is it to put the Ukrainians into the strongest possible negotiation position? Until you can articulate that clearly, I would argue that one is still operating and making decisions before you really do something that is fundamental, which is defining what you want to achieve, and thereby doing the next step, which is, okay, in order to achieve that, what weapons do we need to give, what political decisions do we need to make in our capitals, what economic ramifications will that have for us? So I think these are fundamental questions which I imagine we'll touch on, and particularly, of course, the other concern today is that we've seen Marco Rubio, Secretary of State for the United States, saying that their patience is running out and that they might just pull out. I mean, I think this won't surprise anybody. I think this has been their intention for a very long time. They basically want to put some kind of deal on the table. If it's accepted, then great, Trump gets a win. If it's rejected, well, it's Europe's problem, and it's Ukraine's problem, and most likely they will blame the Ukrainians for that, not the Russians. So this is entirely predictable, but it is fundamental for Europe, and I hope that in those conversations that are taking place at the moment, I hope that they are talking about, okay, what do we actually want to achieve? Even if they don't articulate it publicly, until they can define that, then I would say that some of the other conversations are only going to be an interim for what will eventually have to be the defining conversation.
Fantastic. Cormac.
Cormac Smith. So just a very brief introduction on me. I've spent about the last 35 years of my career working in professional communications, the last 2 decades working in government communications, both at local government in the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office, and of course I spent 2 years embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a British diplomat between 2016 and 2018. My education began in around 2014 when I started getting invited to former communist countries to speak on government communications. My education really took off when I went to Ukraine in 2016. So, you know, that's me. Now I have left government. I plough my own furrow. I'm self-employed. What I do to fight in the information space over the last, I think, 3.5 years, I've done somewhere between 300 and 400 interviews on radio, television, podcasts. Been doing a lot of stuff with Jonathan, who I think we met about 1.5 years ago, Jonathan.
That's about that, yep.
And it's been a great pleasure. Look, so much of what Francis has said I could just violently agree with, so I'm not going to enumerate the points. I think what I'd like to say just as a starting thought, I wrote with the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Klimkin at the time, and anybody who knows about how government works, this is how op-eds get written. Myself and Pavlo sat down to write an op-ed for The Guardian. It's still online, it can be got. And the headline of that op-ed was, Putin will not stop at Ukraine in his desire to put the Russian Empire back together. So my point from that, I started saying, I think, very early 2017, we need to see Russia through Ukrainian eyes. And as to Francis's point about why we seem to be taking so long to wake up in Europe, if you want to understand the threat, go and speak to Ukrainians, live among Ukrainians. I had the great privilege of working at the heart of the Ukrainian government for almost 2 years. But also speak to other people in the eastern neighbourhood, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Speak to the Poles. I was at a barbecue before I came here today, and I was speaking to a former work colleague of my partner, who was a Polish lady in her mid-40s, and she told me what I have lost count to the amount of times I've heard of it, how much worse the Russians were than the Germans ever were during the worst atrocities carried out in World War II. So actually, what we need to do is see Russia through Ukrainian eyes, Baltic eyes, Polish eyes, and certainly Finnish eyes as well. Because these are the people that really understand, they have grown up with the threat. I will just leave it at that for the time being, just as an opening thought, and I will hand over to my new friend Edward.
Thanks, it's wonderful to be here. Like Cormac, I've had an exposure to the region and to Ukraine for many years as well. I first went over to Ukraine as a tourist in 1999. I started my career as an economist, analyzing the economies of Central and Eastern Europe. Traveled in the region a lot, and then I was a NATO official from 2014 to 2020, and in that capacity I also participated in official NATO visits to Ukraine, so we had a lot of exchanges with the Ukrainian government as well. Although that type of process is very formal and it's not necessarily the most interesting, but it was interesting nonetheless. What we are going through now, and I'll cut to the chase, what we're going through now effectively answers a question that I had asked myself from a very young age, which is, how could all these horrible things in the 1930s and 40s happen? And how could people be so strategically blind? And why did appeasement happen? And now we know, because we're witnessing it. Maybe we'd forgotten. But the reality is that states behave in very peculiar ways, and that's maybe my best expertise out of all the things I know. And having been at NATO for 6 years really helps to understand that, because you actually see state behavior. Just to give you sort of an illustration of what it is like to work at NATO, because some people might think it's something a bit mysterious. Basically, it's a military alliance on the one hand and an intergovernmental organization on the other. And when you work at NATO headquarters in Brussels, where I worked, you have committee meeting after committee meeting where every member state is represented, has a representative, an ambassador, called permanent representatives. And everything is discussed there, from the strategic to the nitty-gritty of approving a small budget for a small project. But the point is, you see how states behave. You see how states shy away from danger. You see how states try to pass the buck from one to the other. And that is systematic behavior. And that's what we're up against. Because the tragedy of Europe is that for the most part we are small states. And Russia, for all its failings and weaknesses, is a pretty large state with a large nuclear arsenal. And the reality is that most countries, maybe even every country in the world, is at some level afraid of Russia. Even the United States. And we saw that. We saw Biden clearly broadcast fear of Russia. And so there was no deterrence, and so the invasion started. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you think about it, that the Russians were able to amass a huge invasion force, and everybody knew what it was for. And then they were asked, oh, you're going to invade? No, we're not going to invade. And then they invade. I mean, that's extraordinary. Such a crime against peace. And nobody stopped them. Except, of course, for the Ukrainian armed forces, which fought and still fight with incredible courage and incredible sacrifice. But as you know, they had to wait for the Russians to bring the fight onto Ukrainian territory, which is why we had the terrible destruction we had. They were not allowed to do a preemptive strike, or they were very strongly discouraged from preemptive strikes. It took so much lobbying, so much effort, so much time to finally get Western governments to agree to allow Ukraine to carry out strikes into Russian territory using Western-supplied weapons. That was, in a sense, a victory of everyone who pushed for that decision, but it took years. And we cannot continue like this. We are currently facing a situation where the United States is trying to impose a dictated peace, very much to the benefits of Russia, where Russia gets to keep the so-called land bridge from Donbass to Crimea, which was a major strategic goal for years. I mean, it almost matches the so-called Novorossiya concept that the Russians were talking about already years ago. And this already is hugely problematic. And where we are now, unfortunately, everybody is quacking like little ducks in unison about a peace deal, a peace deal, a peace deal. But even if peace is not forthcoming soon, it's hard to see how we could arrange for Ukraine to reconquer its territories. And that in and of itself is a problem and a threat to peace, a threat to Ukraine and a threat to the peace of all of Europe. In my mind, and I'm a bit hawkish from that perspective, in my mind the goal should be and must absolutely remain that we do everything we can to enable and empower Ukraine to potentially reconquer all of its territories, all, including Crimea.
Let's jump into the first question, and I think I'm going to dive into maybe one of the more difficult topics, but it is also coming to the top of the agenda at the moment. Now, we've seen for many years, those who've watched Russia realize that Russia does not behave in an economically rational fashion. It uses its economy, it uses its resources as a weapon of war, with no care, no regard for the population and what we would sort of think of as rational economic uses. There is signs that Trump is doing the same, or starting to go down that path with the US economy, using it as a kind of tool of warfare, a battering ram. The question here is that it seems that now the Euro-Atlantic alliance has been sort of comprehensively weakened. Now that NATO is all but emasculated and turned into something of a zombie institution, it has seemed clear, at least to Russia watchers, that the EU, as the next bastion of law and order, would be the next target. So a double-barreled question. Do you agree with that? And do you fear that the US economy is about to be used as a battering ram to try and take apart the EU, especially using the tool of tariffs?
I think it has always been the intention of Putin to drive wedges between countries in Europe and indeed between the NATO alliance. And of course he has had a great degree of success with that of late. I think the United States is seeking in its tariff policy to acquire leverage politically. It's not only about the economic arguments that Trump makes and self-sufficiency and all of this, it's about him trying to acquire political leverage over various different countries with moderate degrees of success, I think, given the reactions that we've seen in the last few weeks. In terms of Article 5, NATO, Europe, I think that certainly the United States has a great degree of scepticism of both of those institutions. NATO, particularly because of the expense, and the European Union, because of its scepticism of that in a kind of political sovereign sense. There's a sort of uncomfortableness on the Trumpian right with it as an institution, and I think that they are quite willing, in a way that previous administrations were not, to try and advance their ideology with regard to political institutions on other countries. I mean, one of the things I think that's sometimes underappreciated is that when Hegseth gave that speech at Munich, where he talked about, he said to European leaders' faces that, he was opposed to the way in which they've been operating in recent decades. This really is a huge shift. Countries aren't meant to try and force other countries, particularly allies, to change their behaviour domestically. You're meant to try and keep out of their democratic interests. This White House is not doing that. It is deliberately trying to acquire political leverage and force change in Europe on Ukraine and on its former, and I say former and to underscore, allies. So I'm afraid that we do need to think very seriously about the prospect of further disintegration. NATO is step one, and I think you're right that Article 5 has been profoundly eroded. I think the European Union will be step two. Bear in mind, we've got many more years of this. Although I would say, and I know we've talked about this before, Jonathan, that there are, I think, wider questions to be had about the European Union's role in this war and in the challenges particularly to come. I think one of the great unanswered questions of the war, particularly earlier on, which will be for historians to try and solve, is the degree to which the big institutions like NATO, like the European Union, were pivotal for giving and enabling vital support for Ukraine to survive early on, versus it actually being perhaps a delay. Because what one often sees with big organisations is that everybody wants to, you have to agree a line, that takes time. Forging consensus takes time. Do we have time in the months and years ahead? Did we have time then? Maybe some decisions that were delayed then could have prevented some of the worst things that have happened in the last 3 years. Now, I'm not saying I want to see the defenestration of the European Union, but I'm just saying that there is questions to be asked here, and that is why I've thought for a very, very long time that if we're looking for fundamental change for European defence, it has to happen outside of those institutions, NATO and the European Union. And that is why we're seeing the coalition of the willing. We should have been having the coalition of the willing conversation 3 years ago. Not because of the reason I've just said about the European Union, but because the European Union has Hungary in it, because it has Slovakia in it, and thus has the ability to veto, ultimately, really profound shifts. And those really profound shifts could be the things where they say this far and no further, and then we're really in a bind. And I think a lot of European leaders do understand that. So I'm afraid on these questions, I think that yes, it is Putin's intention to disintegrate both of those organisations. But there is also, I think, broader questions to be saying that maybe actually we should be thinking beyond them ourselves.
Again, going back to my time in Ukraine, I'm a proud European. I'm Irish by birth. I've lived in this country for 38 years. But I love Europe. But it wasn't until I went to Ukraine, it was the Ukrainians who made me understand how important Europe was. Not the EU, not the NATO members of Europe, and the EU has its role to play, but Europe as a concept where democracy had thrived for 80 years now, since the end of the Second World War and with the transatlantic alliance. Somebody said recently, I can't lay claim to this, 500 million Europeans expect 340 million Americans to protect them from 140 million Russians who can't even defeat 40 million Ukrainians. Very good friend of mine, former Colonel Philip Ingram, who was a Colonel in military intelligence, and actually we met through this whole Ukraine war thing because Philip probably does a lot more than me on the broadcasting. We got together to see if we could do some stuff together. And Philip has got himself recently a gig on Times Radio, where 2 times a week he is interviewing some seriously big people. This week he interviewed General Ben Hodges, who is certainly one of the military men who I have been hanging on his every word for over 3 years and have huge respect for. And Philip asked Ben the very simple question, could Ukraine fight on without US support? Ben had absolutely no hesitation and said, yeah, of course they can. And the proviso on that is that Europe, and it's probably got to be Europe plus, because remember, I speak to Ukrainians who tell me all the time that they consider Britain as their greatest ally, especially over the last 3 years. So it can't just be the EU, it's got to be Europe, Britain at the heart of Europe, but maybe it's got to be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and maybe Japan as well, because these are countries where it is as simple as it's our way of life that is under threat at the moment. And I'll remind you that Donald Trump I've lost count of how many times he has said he believes, whether he believes it or not, but he has said the European Union was set up to screw America. This is part of his grievance politics. So we've known for a number of years that Putin wanted to divide and conquer and see the European Union and Europe weakened. We have all the evidence is there for that. We're now unfortunately in a situation, and I went on, not to boast or say I told you so, but my first or second interview, not of this year, of 2024, I went on an interview with LBC, I believe it was, and I said that I believed that regardless of who won the election later on in 2024, whether it was Harris or Trump, that America was most likely lost as the reliable security partner that we had known in Europe for nearly 4 decades. I think that is unfortunately becoming absolutely clear. And it is, I looked at some figures, and I won't bore you by going through all of them, but I looked at some comparative figures before I came in as to the combined military might of Europe plus Ukraine. We outstrip the US by a long, long way. If you take nuclear weapons out of it, if we talk about conventional forces, professional soldiers, reservists, tanks, artillery pieces, fighter aircraft, and the Europe and Ukraine combined, this is without going to the Canadians or the Japanese or whoever else, outstrip the US almost 2-1. We outstripped China. We outstripped Russia. Unfortunately, it was the great Prussian strategist von Clausewitz in the 19th century who said, he talked about the most important elements to win at war was courage and the will to fight. Now, Ukraine, all of you here know, have shown the most incredible will, not just of their government, not just of their armed forces, but of the third element that is absolutely essential to win at war, of their civil society, of their people. We are a long, long way away from that in Europe at the moment. And I've been saying for, as Jonathan knows, for a number of years, for a number of years as a professional communicator, I love my sound bites. I've been saying this wolf will come to our door. I've been saying it's our money and guns today or our daughters and sons tomorrow. And I believe that with every atom in my body. And that is the issue. You know, if Europe supports Ukraine, Reznikov, the last minister of defense from whom this bracelet came from, said on CNN in December, just before Christmas 2021, he said, "We don't need your boots on the ground. Give us the weapons we need and we will do our own fighting." It's been said that Joe Biden, for 3 years, looked at what Ukraine needed and gave them half. And we've heard all the stories about, not giving them weapons, taking 2 or 3 years to give them F-16s or Atacams or whatever it was, or modern battle tanks. And bit by bit, they were drip-fed them. And then the handcuffs were kept on because, of course, they couldn't use them behind enemy lines to strike. So I absolutely believe this wolf is coming to our door. It will come in a very, very direct way to the countries in Eastern Europe, which either will or will not draw the rest of us into it, but it will also massively destabilise and impoverish our economies. This is striking now at the very way of life that we have, and it's not enough for all of us in this room to want our governments to do more and to want more money to be spent on military. The point that I've been trying to develop with Philip and others recently is we need 500 million Europeans moving onto a war footing. Because, I'm 62, so I was educated at school in the 70s and university in the 80s. And I studied the Cold War and I studied MAD, mutually assured destruction. And I grew up thinking that these horrible things, and I was watching last night one of the history channels about the atrocities carried out by the Nazis. I grew up, as I presume most people in this room did, thinking this was something in the past. This was something we learned from history books. And maybe I had 3 uncles or granduncles who fought Hitler, and they all told me at different times, they told me some amazing stories. And suddenly, so we've taken all this for granted. We've taken the freedoms that we have for granted, and we moan and complain in a very, very narrow, I think, area about cost of living or whatever. To me, moving onto a war footing means 3 things. It means every single one of us probably needs to accept that they may have to pay more taxes, that they may have lower public services, and ultimately, as the people of Ukraine who live under martial law, and I was talking to a friend of mine who was going back to Ukraine recently, and he was saying he was trying to get home and get back in before curfew. It may well be that sooner or later we will have to accept restrictions on our freedoms. Now, the problem is America is never going to have to face that. The Russian population have probably been on a war footing for decades, such as the propaganda that they are fed on a daily and a nightly basis by the Kremlin-controlled channels. So again, that's the thought that I really want to put to you. I believe this wolf is coming to us, and there is no doubt in my mind that if we have the combined will, that in Europe, As I said, it was the Ukrainians who started to make me understand how special Europe was as a concept in terms of democracy. We're well capable of looking after ourselves. America is lost, and I fully expect, I would like to think I'm wrong, but I fully expect or fear for the worst in coming days in terms of what America will do. But remember, Ukraine is now producing about 40% of their own armaments, and they're increasing daily. So that's the thought that's occupied me recently. All of us in Europe who've taken these great freedoms for granted. If you come from Ukraine, by the way, you don't take these freedoms for granted. That's what I learned when I went there. But all of us who do need to be willing to move on to a war footing for what that means. I hope that doesn't make me sound like a warmonger, because every other war in history I've learned about through history books. This war is the most personal to me, because it's affecting friends of mine every day. And I do not know a Ukrainian who has not lost somebody over the last 3 years. Ever.
I'd like to offer maybe a reflection or an analogy to understand the issues with EU, NATO versus coalition of the willing, because I think that's a really, really important point for policy and for how we can better protect Europe and also help Ukraine. Think of the analogy of being the difference between a pack of wolves and a herd of zebras. Zebras have stripes, and the interesting thing about animals that live in herds is that, to a degree, if you see how they behave when they're being circled by a predator, is that they try not to stick out, because they're hoping that they will not be individually picked off. Of course, they do have other defense mechanisms which are a bit better than that, and you don't want to be a sole predator attacking a herd of buffaloes. They may trample you. But fundamentally, European countries and the European collective has got used to being a bit like a herd of zebras. Think of the hesitations that Olaf Scholz had about tanks, about missiles, all of that. What was that behavior? It was, I'm not putting my head above the parapet because Putin might whack me. So I'm going to go with the safe option. And he kept on saying, I took an oath to the German people. I'm not going to put them in harm's way. So yeah, we're going to give stuff to the Ukrainians, but we're only going to give them stuff that's not especially prominent so that nobody notices us. And that, in a sense, is what happened under the whole Biden period. We're now in an even worse situation, but what happened under the Biden period was escalation management from the Americans and Europeans, many Europeans, trying not to stick out of the herd, with a few exceptions. And it's from the positive exceptions that we should learn. It's from the moments when the Brits went further than others. It's from the moments when the Poles went further than others. You remember these different moments. And those were the moments when aid to Ukraine was better. And what kind of dynamic was that? Was it a big EU meeting, a big NATO meeting? No. That was coalition of the willing dynamics with peer pressure and leading by example. And that's what we need, and that will protect Europe 100 times better than big institutional setups, which have their weaknesses, precisely as the other speakers have been saying, because of Hungary, because of Slovakia, and now, unfortunately, because of the United States of America. And so what we need to do is take the very best spirit that we had, the very best moments, and the strongest lessons that we learned about how we act as a collective at the European level, and do more of that. So we need to encourage deliberately coalition of the willing. We need to have yardstick competition between European countries, and we basically need to shame one another into doing more. And that's where I think political activism and communication comes into play as well, including for everyone on this panel and for everyone in this room. Keep on fighting, keep on pushing, keep on putting the message out, and if you're active on social media, by the way, one point I want to make here. If you're active on social media, don't do it anonymously. Don't do it anonymously. It's an ocean of trolls and bots out there. Use your real name, your real location. The danger to you is infinitesimally small. nothing's going to happen to you. But if you're a voter in this country or in another European country, you want your member of parliament to know that there's a real voter who wants a higher defence budget. So connecting with what Cormac was saying absolutely correctly. For a country like the UK to finally increase its defence budget responsibly requires a signal from the public. Because the two major political parties always play the same game. They have closed-door meetings with the Treasury. They have their own political assessment of what it would do to the economy to increase, to even put a tiny increase on public spending or a tiny increase on taxation. And they're absolutely convinced it's a kind of intellectual self-paralysis. They're absolutely convinced that there's no margin of maneuver. And the other European countries are the same, by the way. That's why Italy did absolutely nothing until this year, or Belgium did absolutely nothing until this year. I was having a discussion with a very experienced a Belgian official, former official, quite recently, and I said we absolutely have to increase defence spending. And immediately he shot back, and he was sort of in his 60s, maybe 70s, immediately shot back, yeah, but there's pension, there's a health system, we don't have the margin, we don't have the fiscal space. Hey, you know what? You'll have even less fiscal space if you're at war. So, or if the war broadens or worsens or etc. So, fiscal space can be created. Taxes can be increased. It doesn't all need to be borrowing and then the bond market hammers you. It is possible, it is doable. The UK can increase its tax burden. But it's not going to happen unless both Labour and Conservatives become convinced that not only is it the right thing to do strategically, but also that they're not going to lose the election because of that. And they'll only think that if the public comes out and says, we want this. We want to pay more in tax. You have to say it publicly. You have to tell your MP, whatever part of the country you live in, you have to literally tell your MP that that is your position. Okay, and that's very, very important. Because the extent to which it's a closed circle discussion, where the assumption is that it cannot be done, or that it's undesirable, is really one of the greatest weaknesses that one finds in many European countries, and the UK is a terrible example of that. It sort of keeps on repeating itself. But back to the idea of, or back to the issue of the US, here I think, and I agree with the other panelists very much, we have multiple problems with the US, and it's not only because of Trump. Under both parties, the way that the United States views nuclear deterrence and nuclear issues is not fit for purpose for our continent. And it's time we recognize that. Our governments have basically gone along with the US position because traditionally we've assumed that we benefit from the American deterrent. But how sure are we now that the Americans would ever risk nuclear war with the Russian Federation or with anyone, even if we were under attack? And it's not just Trump. Under Biden, it was very clear that the United States really did not want to risk direct contact with the Russians. And when the scenarios of a possible Russian use of a nuclear weapon against Ukraine came up, what the Biden administration was planning to do was to hit the Russians conventionally, not nuclear, which is kind of revealing. And Biden's panicky talk about Cuba Missile Crisis and all that nonsense, that was there too. So the difficulty here is that actually the Americans don't believe in mutually assured destruction because they don't have the stomach for that way of thinking anymore. That's gone. I think it died probably with the end of the Cold War. And on the other hand, look at Ukraine. Theoretically, Ukraine could be subject to a Russian nuclear strike any day. It could have happened at any moment. You could think theoretically maybe the Russians get fed up because they're not winning, so they just use a nuclear weapon. But it hasn't happened. And the other thing is, if you're Ukraine, and you know this of course in this room, you pretty much are fighting as if the nuclear weapons didn't exist. And they still haven't been used. So what's the lesson here? Well, it's the same for the other European countries. We have to fight against the Russians, or prepare to fight against them, as if they didn't have nuclear weapons. Because probably they wouldn't use them. But we have to have the capability to retaliate if they do, and we also want to deter them. So what does that mean? Anything out of Washington about nuclear weapons, ignore. And I'm not saying this just to you, I hope governments hear me say this. I think Europeans need a completely different new approach and a new strategic way of thinking that basically clears away with everything that comes out of the United States about nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine. I want it all gone. I think it's no longer fit for purpose, and Ukraine, the case of Ukraine proves it every damn day. What we Europeans need is we need our own nuclear deterrent. We have 2 nuclear armed states, the UK and France. I believe that Europe would be much more secure if we had additional nuclear armed states. And yes, I think Moscow would behave very differently if Ukraine had its own nuclear weapons, even if it were a relatively rudimentary capability, like a North Korean type of device. That would already make the Russians calm down real quick, in my opinion. And I'd also be quite fine with Poland having nuclear weapons. And I mean this absolutely seriously. I'm a former NATO official. I would have been thrown out a fucking window if I had said that while I was a NATO official. But we have to adapt to the reality of what is being done to us and what is being done to our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. The reality is, the lesson is that we have to have, is that nuclear weapons makes you more secure. And it's not just in Europe that this is clear. Look at Pakistan. India has 10 times more people than Pakistan. But Pakistan can keep India at bay, and India can keep Pakistan at bay. Nuclear deterrence works. But there is, I can tell you, in professional circles, an enormous power behind the US-centric way of considering nuclear weapons. All of the discussions, all of the academic work, all of the activism, it's incredibly US-centric. And that needs to change. We need European thinking that draws in full the lessons from the Ukraine war to develop a new way of thinking about nuclear weapons. And frankly, I'll be very blunt, I don't care about the treaties. Non-proliferation treaty, test ban treaty. For me, all this arms control stuff is not fit for purpose anymore because Russia just violates all the treaties, first of all, and then, I mean, we need to survive here. You probably know this, but states in Eastern Europe are stepping out of the Treaty Against Landmines, the Ottawa Convention. That's the kind of thing that has to happen. So, sorry if there was many different points, but coalition of the willing, we all have to move forward, we have to egg each other on, so to speak. And we need new European strategic thinking. Thank you.
Just a very quick point on what Edward said, and 2 little stories. First one was back in 2022, around June I think it was, there was a security conference in Kyiv, and that security conference was attended by former General Wesley Clark, who is the former Supreme Commander of NATO. And he said 3 things. In a long speech, and there was 3 things he said. He said, give Ukraine every single weapon they need, and he mentioned including F-16s and A-10s. This was the summer of 2022. He said, give Putin no off-ramp. And the third thing he said was, do not be intimidated by his nuclear threats. Now the second point, I was out in The Hague in the Netherlands last August. I have a very good friend who's a senior Ukrainian diplomat out there, he's chargé d'affaires. And I try and get out and visit him from time to time because we worked very closely when I was in Kyiv. And he told me at the time that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this was last August, had counted no less than 120 times when Ukraine had rattled the nuclear sabre. And what we know is every single time we have crossed Russia's red lines, they have done fuck all.
We're now going to switch the format up a little because I've got 100 questions here. So what I'm going to do now is fire 1 question at each of the panel members. And we're going to sort of give slightly punchier answers so we can get through the questions before the end. And I will try to target the questions at the sort of strengths of each of the panel members. So let's start with Francis here. We've seen a real gap between words and actions. I think that's come through strongly in what's been said this evening. What is a robust and credible security guarantee for Ukraine? One that would genuinely deter future Russian aggression, even when the current round of aggression has been dealt with.
Fundamentally, Putin has not abandoned his maximalist objectives for Ukraine, which European leaders tend to conveniently forget, but remains still, by definition, the erasure of Ukrainian democracy. This is not just a question of the territories that Russia has annexed, even though it doesn't control the four of them, the fifth being Crimea, which it does, control them all militarily. This is something much more fundamental. And I think that one of the first steps that could be made, which I think you could define in a sense as a security guarantee, would be, and I don't think we're as far away from this as some people might think, for European leaders to move troops into Ukraine and draw some kind of red line halfway across the country. Now, you could say that that's not enough, but I think immediately what that would do, even if you just moved a few hundred, few thousand troops into the west of the country, is you're making it very, very clear that Kyiv will not fall. You shift the dial of moving away from the maximalist objectives which Russia is still pursuing. I think that is, in a sense, a kind of security guarantee for Ukraine and its future. Then, in terms of the longer term, I think it has to be, again, some kind of line drawn at some point in the country and saying that if this line is crossed, there will be very, very serious consequences that will be military. Now, I think there will be a great degree of hesitancy among European leaders as to define what that military response is, unfortunately. But nonetheless, there are many, many options that would be on the table if you had, as I say, troops in the west of the country and indeed a so-called peacekeeping force if it came after a ceasefire. Now, the problem is that, of course, from the Russian perspective, they are thinking that as long as we maintain the war at the current level, then there is no chance that European countries are going to feel brave enough to go in. And that is why I was so interested in President Macron's remarks a few weeks ago, where he said, we will act regardless of the situation on ceasefire and regardless of what Putin says. Now, I'm sceptical as to whether he really means that and whether he really has the rest of the coalition of the willing in unison on that point. But if that is true, then I think it would be a very, very significant step indeed. And so I think that this is where we need to be thinking in both the short term and the longer term. Because at the moment, Putin is playing for everything. And we have to take that off the table.
Cormac, here's one for you, and I'm quoting one of your little strap lines that you use in many of our interviews here. So it has been said that there cannot be security without Europe, but at the moment, the security of Europe, indeed the future architecture of Europe and global security, seems to be being decided in other capitals, particularly Moscow and Washington. The challenge here is that if you're not at the table, and Europe seems not to be at the table, then you are on the menu.
I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier on. We have, look, the combined European Union and Britain is over 10 times the economic might of Russia. Russia famously has an economy smaller than Italy. We have a combined population over 3 times the size of Russia. There is absolutely no reason. We have very, very skilled armed forces, not least in this country. It goes back to, I love quoting I quoted him already, the 19th century Prussian strategist, military strategist von Clausewitz, who said there's 3 things you need to win at war. You need your army in the right place, your government in the right place, and you need your people in the right place. But he further said it's about courage and the will to fight. Russia thinks we're weak. I remember looking at, when I was out in Ukraine, there was a fabulous piece of research released, which had been carried out, and it's well worth, it's online, so let me get it right. It had been carried out by the Eastern Centre, the Centre for Eastern Partnership, and the name of the particular organisation that was set up after Maidan to counter disinformation is escaping me. It will come back. It was somebody help me out. But what they did was they spent over 2.5 years looking at how Europe was portrayed in Russian media, mainly on Russian television, which, remember, television is far more important in Russia than it is certainly in Western Europe, and also it is controlled absolutely by the Kremlin. And they had about 5 repeating narratives. And one of those, they talked about the disintegration and the decadence of the West. They see us as weak and effete. And they tell their people this all the time, and they see us as degenerate and corrupt, and they've been telling their people for decades that ultimately they need to come into Europe to save us from ourselves, the same way as they're liberating Ukrainians in the occupied territories. So yeah, very much, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. The decision is ours to make. We have the money, we have the expertise, we have I won't bore you with the figures, but when you look at our conventional military forces already, when we add them up along with Ukraine's, we way outmatch what America or Russia has. What we don't have at the moment is the will to fight. I've said before, we need to see the world, or we need to see Russia through Ukrainian eyes. We have an awful lot that we can learn from the Ukrainians. Even before this horrible further invasion went out, I found that Ukrainians, on the one hand, were some of the warmest, most hospitable people, and I lived among them for 2 years, but also hard as bloody nails. And that's because of their history. So that's what we need to do. We did it before. We did it in this country during the Blitz. In my country, Ireland, 300,000 Irishmen. And I can back that figure up. From both the island of Ireland and the diaspora fought Hitler. We did it then. We need to rediscover that. And again, this is something that I'm trying to develop in podcasts and interviews that I do. It's about us as citizens moving on to a war footing and understanding. My father taught me to fight when I was about 6 years of age. And he told me, when you get into a fight, 1, you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and 2, you are going to get hurt. Make sure you hurt the other person more than they hurt you. And we've got to be willing to take some pain, because if we don't, as Jonathan said, I love the sound bites, it's our money and guns today, or our daughters and sons tomorrow. And, again, to quote von Clausewitz, the best way to avoid war is prepare for war. The head of the British Army said just before Christmas, the British Army is not ready to fight, and if we're not ready to fight, we're not ready to deter. That was General Sir Roland Walker. We need to wake up. We should have woken up 3 years ago. We should be putting our industries on a war footing 3 years ago. We should have been getting, and government is lacking in its communications to people. But we all, every single person in this room, not just those of us on the panel, every single person in this room has a role to play and can punch in the information war. Because I don't believe that there has been a war in history where the information space has been so critical.
And this one very much angled towards Edward, especially from the NATO angle. It seems that we have already lost one of the major battles. That was to deter Russia before the full-scale war. We've lost another battle, which was to equip Ukraine to push them back in 2023. That window of opportunity was lost as well. And we now find ourselves in a kind of war, but pretending we're not in a war. My question here really is, at what point did we stop paying attention to history? At what point did we stop observing Moscow and its behaviours and stop understanding their military doctrine? Because in the light of history, none of what they've done should be a surprise, and yet their every move seems to make us take us on the back foot.
I think everyone in this room has a good understanding of Russian state behavior. The question is, why do our governments seem not to have that understanding? An understanding that is readily available to millions of people across, certainly in Russia's neighborhood, across Eastern Europe. I mean, I work for a Finnish organization. Finns understand the Russians pretty well. Baltics the same, Poles the same, in the Caucasus you go there, Central Asians. I mean, everybody who's come a little bit too close to Russian imperialism or Soviet imperialism knows exactly. And yet, I can tell you from my NATO experience that, and you see it in public discourse as well, and you see it also in a number of academic publications, and this has gone on for decades, the extent to which, the depth of willful misunderstanding and misreading of Russia is absolutely spectacular. But it hasn't happened completely by coincidence. First of all, the Soviet Union back then and the Russian state today puts an enormous amount of effort in trying to fool people. It's a system that practices deception all the time. I mean, they just lie. They lie about who they are, what they believe in, what they want. The techniques are well known. Whataboutism is one of the main techniques that they use all the time against everyone all the time. But I think it's important to go a little bit in depth as to, so they do that and they have their reasons, but why our governments and are a receptive audience. This does go back to human nature and to the fact that most European states are small. And at the end of the day, I think we have to give credit to the fact that if you are in power in a small European country, you know deep down that you're probably not going to prevail if you're attacked by a much larger state. And small states develop coping mechanisms, survival mechanisms, and some of those are not very effective and may even make things worse, like, for example, denying reality. But as it so happens, those states that are very close to Russia are not delusional. You talk with the Estonians, you talk with the Finns, obviously with Ukrainians as well. But the terrible thing that we need to be aware of and that we need to admit fully is that however close we feel among Europeans and however much we've grown together with the European project, with NATO, with everything else, and Brexit doesn't make, to my mind, that big a difference. I mean, British people deep down, most of them do feel very European. I mean, and British people know they're European. They don't believe they're African or Asian, as far as I'm aware. So, but the issue is this. The harsh reality is that Europe is a bunch of little islands. We're more like an archipelago. Every country develops its own purely national discourse about strategic realities, about foreign policy and all of that. National elites in Europe are more national in their nature than our populations. People in this room, people on this panel, people who listen to the content of Silicon Curtain from across Europe, probably most listeners are more European and have a more continent-wide way of looking at reality than do our governments. And that is, if you like, by construction. And that's what needs to be overcome every time. Now, the people who rule us are not complete idiots. They know that it's not good. The government of Belgium knows that it's not good for Belgium if Germany is invaded by Russia, and that it also wouldn't be good if Poland were invaded by Russia. So they understand that. But nevertheless, if you look, for example, at where the money is, where public spending is, 95% plus of public spending in Europe is in national budgets, not EU budget, right? It was always a myth of the Brexiteers that the EU spends lots of money. No, I mean, the EU budget is small. The big money and the big powers and control of the armed forces and all the national security functions, it's national 90% plus. And so it's actually always a mountain to climb and to overcome to manage to get all of the Europeans to pull together in the same direction. But frankly, it's like herding cats. That's the reality. There's a lot, many of our citizens are wiser than our governments. And it's not because our governments are idiots, it's because the setup is national. Look, if it were up to me, I've even said this publicly on social media, if it were up to me, we would already have deployed forces into Ukraine. Or we would have just knocked Russia's teeth out and it would be over, because we would have defeated Russia. I said it in public, I was in favor of Western countries officially entering the war on Ukraine's side, which would be completely legal, by the way, just in case anyone has any doubt. We went the way of just supplying weapons, and we didn't even do that properly. You have, be in no doubt, you have everybody here, everybody on this panel is fully on your side and fully agrees with what you just said, okay? No, I mean, I want to be clear so that you don't misunderstand anything I said. What I was talking about before is a political analysis of why countries are not so active or do not have so much solidarity. It's how governments behave. And the fact is that it's harder to get a country like Spain or Portugal to understand the Russian threat and to feel it. It's not a coincidence, not at all a coincidence, that the Baltic states and Poland gave proportionately a lot more military assistance, and now also Denmark, Sweden and Norway, a lot more proportionately than did Portugal and Spain, let alone the US. It's just distance. It's as simple as that. And as for understanding the Russia threat, which was the original question, the further away you are geographically from Russia, the more people are completely moronic about Russia. I mean, just look at Indian commentary on Russia. I mean, it's just hilarious. They're just completely brainwashed by some sort of half-baked Soviet propaganda, even at very high levels. Or look at the Pope. I mean, you know, this is laughable. But it's the way it is, and we have to fight against that every day, and we have to, I don't know what to do. I mean, we keep on talking. Yes, I know it's frustrating, but we have to carry on doing it, because the Russians keep on feeding the beast. They spend hundreds of millions, maybe billions a year in propaganda. You can see how they turned Republican opinion in the United States using the American grifter economy. We know that people like Tim Pool and others cashed in millions, literally, to spread anti-Ukrainian propaganda. That's the way it works, and propaganda works. So it's a permanent battle. And so just on the point of talking, and Cormac knows this better than anyone, but I mean, we have to carry on talking and making the points and fighting back against the disinformation every day, forever. And it's like, you know, I'm fed up with cutting my hair, it'll grow back. No, you have to cut your hair regularly. But anyway, maybe Cormac can pick up.
I just want to say very, very briefly, all four of us on the panel here are absolutely dedicated to Ukraine's cause. We are doing what we can. What the four of us do is we work primarily in the information space. And the answer to your question, why do people not care? People need to be better informed. People need to have Russian disinformation squashed because it is hugely powerful. And we need to, talking for myself, and I think I can talk for the other three at the table, what I have done for 3.5 years since about a month before the further invasion, is lobby and try to convince journalists, governments, government officials, but mainly the public through media platforms, that they need to think differently and change their mind. I said earlier on, There is no war in history, I believe, where the information space has been more important. That's why Russia probably spends billions on disinformation, which is one aspect of its hybrid warfare toolbox, because they have lost, they cannot beat the West in a fair fight. They can't even beat Ukraine in a fair fight. So the disinformation is hugely important, and that's what the four of us in this panel do. I have huge admiration for people who go out and fight. I'm 62 without much military training to talk about. If I went to the front, I have a broken body as well. I probably wouldn't last very long. I do what I can. But we absolutely understand what you're saying. But the information space is important. And unfortunately, we live in democracies. But autocracies use our democracy against us. You know, it was Winston Churchill that said that democracy was probably one of the worst ways to run a country, but he hadn't come across a better one. Right? We have weaknesses which autocracies like Putin play on. One of the things we have to do, we don't have to convince anybody in this room, but we have a whole population out there, and we have our leaders and people in civil society that we do have to convince. So I've got a clear conscience about what I do.
I can sense the frustration. This event is also going to go out online, where we hope many thousands, if it works well, maybe tens of thousands will see it. This is a war that is essential to fight. Russia pumps hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year into fighting the information warfare. Why? Because they know it works. They know it undermines our societies from the inside out. They know that it weakens the resolve of our politicians. So it may seem that sitting in this room isn't necessarily the best use of your time this evening, but believe me, these are messages that we have to repeat, almost like a religious mantra, over and over. We have to tell better stories than the Russian propagandists. Because if we stop telling these stories and we stop propagating them, then we create a vacuum for Russian propaganda. It's one of the reasons why Russian propaganda doesn't work that well in this country. And it's because we have some historical memory. It's because we tell ourselves these stories that fortify and stiffen our spines a little. My next question, however, does address the points, I think, to the gentleman, the lady who sort of intervened. We espouse values all the time, and you hear this in Europe. We've heard what Macron has said. We seem to still be adhering to what are supposedly old world or old order values about sovereignty, about democracy, about freedom of speech. We talk about Ukrainian sovereignty being sacrosanct. But if we really valued Ukrainian sovereignty, we'd be fighting there alongside them. And this could have been said at any point in the last 3 years of the full-scale war, and at any point in the last 11 years of the long war. This is a question really here for Francis. We say these things, but our actions tell a different story.
Yeah, I think that's true, in the sense that there are certain values which we have all, I think, taken for granted, and we have seen actually that it's also not necessarily believed by as many people as we thought. I mean, I think many people in this room would have been profoundly disappointed by the direction of travel in the United States. And I think that we need to come to terms with the fact that probably within Europe as well, many of the values that we think are held by the majority are not necessarily held by the majority. I mean, there is indeed questions to be raised, and uncomfortable questions, given the context of the 20th century. We like to believe that everybody in the affronts that took place in the 20th century was ready to give their life for the principles that we now all experience because of the sacrifices made by people. But many people did not fight. And it is very, very important, as the points that you've raised, Jonathan, has been raised by this panel, that we continue to talk about the consequences for everybody if we don't fight for these values now. Because ultimately, it comes for you. And if not you, it comes for your children. And I think one of the most concerning things is that if Russia is allowed to, as a consequence of whatever happens in the next few months or even years, is allowed to be seen and to be perceived as benefiting by its illegal activity, by its imperialism, the many more powerful hostile states, like China, will read this as showing that the West is dead, and that if you're just willing to play the long game, then almost any territory that you eye up can be yours. We need to realise that fundamentally, might is not right, but it is becoming right again. And so if we don't want to live in a future where that isn't the case, we have to fight now. We have to fight in every theatre, whether it be military, whether it be information, whether it be political. And I have faith. I have faith in populations. I have faith that when push comes to shove, people do the right thing. But you have to wake them up from their slumber. And that's the fight that we're all engaged in this room. And one day, when the history books are written, we will be proved right. But whatever criticisms we may make of our individual political leaders, ultimately, this is bigger than any one individual who's leading a country. This is about to the points that have already been made. This is about the groundswell of popular opinion. And I actually do agree with you in the sense that all of us share individual responsibility for our moral actions, for the actions of our government.
Edward, this is one for you. And again, it comes back, I think, to a historical question, because this isn't the first time we've had to confront Russian aggression. In fact, there have been many, many decades of experience confronting it. And examining that history, which seems to be largely forgotten, unfortunately, by policymakers, it does show there are some lessons about how you contain Moscow's aggression. Even if you can't win it over, you can contain it. Things like the Berlin airlift, packing Europe with effective military deterrence, having a plan on how to hold Moscow at bay, not letting individual dominoes tumble without challenging them. There are certain lessons in how you contain a revanchist Russia. What are the lessons we should be learning? What should Europe be doing already over the last 3 years, which it hasn't done, and what it should be urgently doing now in order to apply those historical lessons to the present?
I think it's very, very clear. Basically, it wasn't a coincidence that Curtis LeMay and others, so he was one of the great American Air Force commanders during the Cold War, talked about peace through strength. Fundamentally, the Russian always has this attitude of push forward with the bayonets. If you encounter mush, carry on. If you encounter steel, you stop. So a steel wall is what will stop the Russian, or communicate to the Russian that he should not come further. But also, we learned from the Cold War experience that having nuclear weapons calms Moscow down. So basically, you want to be able to communicate to Russia that you have the capability to inflict unacceptable costs on them if they cross a certain line. It's really as simple as that. It's just called deterrence. So we need to be strong, much, much stronger, considerably stronger. And as I mentioned earlier, I favor Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons for that purpose. I think that's the easiest, most direct way to put Ukraine on the path towards a sustainable, durable peace. And the parallels exist. Israel has nuclear weapons. It serves Israel extremely well. Like I said before, Pakistan and India, that's a stable dyad, as political scientists would say. So essentially, we just need to be militarily very strong, and we need to show to the Russians that we have the capabilities, the capacities, meaning sufficient inventories, the levels of readiness, and the political will to basically rip their heads off if they ever do something which we don't accept. And so we need to bare our teeth, we need to be more like wolves ourselves. Europeans need to learn to be wolves And the fact that we're smaller than the Russians there is not a problem because we can be a pack. But we have to have that strong, powerful bite, and it's in a sense as simple as that.
I can sense the audience will explode in a minute if we don't give them the chance to ask some questions. This is the last one I'm going to put. I'm going to put it to all the members of the panel, starting with Cormac, and that's the last formal question I will be asking here. It seems that Canada is now the canary in the coal mine. They have seen a former ally, which their economic, military, political, let's say, strength and security was based on, that alliance with the US. They've seen that ally turn into an adversary with alarming speed. And of course, they're much closer to that situation than we are. At some point, it's quite possible that Europe will find itself in the same position as Canada, in direct confrontation with the US itself. Should we take a leaf out of Ukraine's book and fight come what may, will the US potentially try to interfere if Europe supports Ukraine more robustly? And should we cut them out of that equation? Cormac, you first. Punchy answers, and then we'll go to the audience for a Q&A.
There's an old adage that I was hearing long before. As I said earlier on, my education really began when I went to Ukraine, and that's the only way you can deal with Russia is from a position of strength. They always negotiate in bad faith, and they always break their promises. That's a fact. Unfortunately, what seems to be emerging now is America behaving in the exact same fashion. Donald Trump does not respect diplomacy. He only respects one thing. He's interested in money. And recently, we've had a member of his White House staff saying that they were getting increasingly frustrated by European countries continuing to support Ukraine. So I'm not sure what's coming, but it ain't good. So, when you're dealing with, I always use the analogy of the bully at school. And when you're dealing with a bully, if you back down, you say, okay, take my lunch money today, but please, he'll come back and he'll take it tomorrow. He's not going to respect you, or not going to respect you for behaving decently. And we need to learn this lesson on a grand scale in Europe and the others that we can make alliances with, Canada most certainly being one. The only way we are going to survive this is from a position of strength, of standing up to these people. There is no other way. We're not going to get cut some slack because we're nice. It was Winston Churchill who said, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, but I've been quoting it for years and putting it in the words of the former foreign minister of Ukraine. The appeaser is one who feeds crocodiles, hoping that he will be eaten last.
Look, I think fundamentally every European country needs to have what's called strategic autonomy in the sense of defense. We need to be able to handle any contingency we may face, including under a scenario of American abandonment. And European countries now, recently, have become really aware of this, and we'll see where this goes, because these are not easy changes. It's very easy to say that we should do that, but half of Europe have already bought F-35s, for example, and they're extremely expensive, and they are already committed, and we're talking billions of euros or dollars already spent and already committed in one way. So it's not easy at all, but there is maybe an area of hope, and this is where Ukraine teaches the rest of Europe a valuable lesson. Look at what Ukraine has managed to do just with drones. We have to learn the lessons from that, and we have to go with the technological disruption. As Europeans, we have a lot to learn. And I think that, we like to promote ourselves. I'm talking about Western governments in general. Look at all the training we give to Ukrainians, but I think we've got a bunch of our boys to send over there to learn from the Ukrainians, and relatedly, whatever trajectory the war takes, the fact is it is in our essential European collective defense interest that we save the Ukrainian army. Come what may, we have to strengthen the Ukrainian armed forces, work with them more closely, learn from them, and emulate the best practices that they are basically teaching us, notably with joint forces, but not only. We've also seen limitations in some legacy equipment or artillery equipment, for example. This has been studied, and the armed forces study this. But in any case, we have to essentially make common cause with the Ukrainians even more closely than we have, because the Ukrainian army may well be, I think will absolutely be, a fundamental pillar of the future defense of Europe. Thank you.
So about 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump was launching the latest fighter jet, which he calls the F-47, funny enough. And he said, we will sell our armaments to our allies, but we will depower them by about 10% because our allies might not often be our allies. We need to dump America as quick as we can.
We may need to dump America as quick as we can, and we may need to acquire strategic autonomy as soon as possible. But to your question, Jonathan, there are certain facts that we have to accept for now, which is that America does have enormous leverage over us in this war. Not just economically, but also in terms of what it can do with weapons supplies. So just to give one example, Ukraine, of course, has received copious amounts of American material. Now, if the Trump administration were to decide to say that we will no longer provide security patches, we will no longer provide spare parts in the medium to long term, that has a massive consequence for Ukraine's ability to wage this war. Now, Europe, I agree, can fill the gap, and Jack Watling of RUSI has done some brilliant research on this. Europe can fill the gap in the medium to long term. But I think what politicians are doing, and I can accept the frustration, what politicians are trying to do is buy time, so that America is kept in play for as long as possible whilst we prepare. And by God, that is frustrating for those of us who are banging tables. But we have to live in the reality where we are, which is trying to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position and put ourselves in the strongest possible position, whilst accepting that the United States, if it chooses to make things very, very difficult for us, can and quite possibly will. Now, more positively, because it is important to be positive, I don't believe this Trump administration is going to be as politically powerful in its leverage in the next few months and certainly years. The incompetency that we've seen in recent weeks shows that its power is gradually waning domestically and internationally. So if we can survive the next few weeks and months, I think we will be in a stronger position entering 2026. But we have to be realistic as to where we are at this very moment. But Europe does have the capacity, and I do believe that ultimately it will do the right thing, and the willpower is there. But they're trying every other option rather than confront the reality in the room. But that's politicians for you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I know this was a high energy session. We're going to have a short Q&A. There will be a chance for you to meet the speakers afterwards, talk as it were. Thomas, over to you.
Please keep your questions brief and focused. No statements, please.
Thank you. As a technology journalist, I can say that, I speak to your point, Edward, technology is definitely part of the answer. Even Portuguese are doing stuff in that role. My question is that, you made a point earlier about nuclear deterrence, and there was the incident where Prigozhin's Wagner group almost got hold of nuclear backpacks. The Americans are very nervous about that. So that's the nuclear deterrent. Effectively, you are absolutely correct. The nuclear deterrent, or the Americans are very worried about that. What I want to know is, what's the tipping point when Western forces and Western politicians and Western governments go, this is the moment, this is the Berlin Wall. And we've seen that Denmark has sent troops, as you were saying earlier, we're going to learn more from the Ukrainians, sent troops to Ukraine just this week, I believe, to learn from the Ukrainians. Now, they could have not told us. They could have sent them silently, but they published the fact that Danish troops would be in Ukraine learning, not on the front line, but learning drone warfare, for instance. What do you think that either panel, particularly Francis, I'm a big fan of your podcast, what do you think, is there a point at which perhaps there's a stray drone that goes and hits the barracks of the Danish while they're training? What is there going to be a tipping point, and what do you think it is?
Okay, just take two more. Oh, Ukrainian first.
Hello, my name is Anna and I represent cultural sector and also I'm a social activist. I want to ask, of course Russia has started many wars, not only in Ukraine, but the only thing that differs us from other countries, because I'm Ukrainian so I'm saying us, that in 1994 we signed it Budapest Memorandum, and that says that countries who signed it, and UK was in the list of these countries, declares that it will protect our border, our sovereignty, etc. And now, from the perspective of Ukrainian who is living here, I see that this point is not vocalized enough, and people do not understand. We are in the position with Ukrainians, in the position like we are begging for help. And in fact, this is kind of obligation to give us some help, right? Because we gave the third biggest arsenal, nuclear arsenal in the world. And now we are in this position. And I want to ask you, like the representatives of your country, is it kind of a convenient position of the country not vocalize it? Because, for example, if I were the citizen of this country, for me it would be easier to understand why my taxes should be higher. Because my country signed the document, and this country and me as a citizen I have an obligation to pay these taxes higher, and it's not only works from the human perspective, it works more on like kind of documentary perspective that is more stable. Why it's not vocalized enough, and sometimes it's not vocalized at all, Thank you.
One more.
Hello, Luke Marchand. If you watch about Tucker Carlson, the future resident of the 51st state. Question for the panel. It's easy to, well, not easy, but it's important, of course, to discuss the big changes we should make. But one of the most significant changes Ukraine has made in the war was it switched to a core structure earlier this year to fix issues with its brigades. Something intangible but simple. Assuming we struggle to mobilize our electorates in the ways that we all want, what are important steps that we could pitch right now, today, or in the next few weeks and months to have an important impact on the war in European defense? What's tangible?
And rather than everyone answering all the questions, let's have each panel member take one of the questions so we get through more of them.
So just to your question, when will the tipping point come? I'm afraid I can't say when that's going to be, although I would say that inevitably there are going to be moments of decision that are as fundamental for the shape of the European future in the months and years ahead that will, I think, be probably shaped by the kind of activities that you described. So you mentioned, like, will it be a drone strike on a base or something like that? I think it's almost inevitable that Russia will seek using hybrid warfare to probe further into Europe. And that may well be done by major acts of digital sabotage. It may well be literally physical drones. It may even be stray missiles to see exactly what it can get away with. And so I don't know what the tipping point would be, but I would say that that is a very reckless strategy. And ultimately, as we see in history time and time again, when you conduct operations as recklessly as the Russians do, at some point something happens and it can be absolutely fatal for you. Just to give one example, in the First World War, not the Russian context, but with the Germans, the Zimmermann telegram and the sinking of the Lusitania, two things that were basically they were not designed to be fundamental decisions that were made. They were policies that were enacted by certain people who wanted to do certain things within the German government, and yet it brought America into the war. That is how history operates. So I can't answer your question as to what the tipping point will be, but I can say with confidence that an emboldened Russia in Europe will almost certainly make at some point a catastrophic error, which will bring Europe far more further either into this war or into a future escalation to come.
I'll just say a few words about the Budapest Memorandum, because this is something which, even among Ukrainians and very close friends of Ukraine, is sometimes misunderstood. If you read the actual memorandum, it's an extremely weak document, and it has been, by some Ukrainians, a bit overinterpreted as to what it means. That was never what's called a mutual defense clause, which is what you have in the NATO treaty, or what you have in the bilateral treaties between the United States and its treaty allies in Asia, for example, the treaty with Japan, the one with Philippines, etc. The Budapest Memorandum basically means a promise by the three great power signatories not to attack Ukraine. Wow. That's all. Wow. That's all it is. It's nothing. It's terrible. So Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum. Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum by attacking Ukraine. And the only obligation on the other signatories is just to go to the UN to talk about it. That's what the memorandum actually says. And I know that a lot of Ukrainians communicate about this in the hope that it could be interpreted in a somewhat stronger way, but the document itself is nothing. It
literally says protect sovereignty. So what protection means in this?
No. It doesn't say protect sovereignty. Basically it means that the three countries in question are going to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and not exert any coercion on it. So it was basically a promise by the three signatories not to attack Ukraine. That's what the document means. That's all it means. It doesn't have any additional value, okay? That's the reality. That's why there's been no diplomatic process recognized by either the US or the UK to somehow do anything more than what they did. It's not at all. And that's precisely why Ukraine wanted to join NATO, because Ukraine understood that, no, we need a real treaty with an actual defense clause like the NATO treaty. Otherwise, if the Budapest Memorandum were a mutual defense clause, Ukraine would not even have needed to apply to NATO. So that's the reality. But there is another point that has to be made, and that is that Ukraine was convinced to sign this agreement in the context of relinquishing its nuclear arsenal, as you know, and in the context of signing up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this has a number of interesting consequences. It means, number one, Ukraine can validly say, and be very careful about this question, because the Americans are trying to box Ukraine in right now, but the point is that the conditions that enabled Ukraine to relinquish its nuclear weapons have been violated by Russia. Therefore, the conditions that led Ukraine to sign up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty no longer hold. Ukraine has, in my opinion, a valid case in international law to acquire nuclear weapons again.
Yes.
That's important. That's important. Also legally. And I think it's a major lesson of this war in any case. But be careful about one thing. In the what was it called, memorandum of intent or whatever, on the minerals deal, the thing that Ukraine just signed today or yesterday, there is a wording that repeats the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine has to be extremely careful not to be manipulated by the United States once again to be, if you like, not enabled to acquire nuclear weapons. My view is, I'm going to say it very, very bluntly, Ukraine should seek to acquire nuclear weapons by hook or by crook, using deception if necessary. The Ukrainian government should not be truthful to anyone. That's the lesson here. Israel acquired its nuclear weapons without permission. India and Pakistan got their nuclear weapons without anybody's permission. This is the real world. So on the one hand, there's a legal argument that I think can be used ex post when the day that I hope will come, when Ukraine basically walks out of the non-proliferation treaty and says, well, sorry, we have nuclear weapons now. Ukraine should do that, but there's no need to talk about it, just do it.
Very quick answer to the gentleman here. I think you asked what could be done tangibly. So I'm going to have a bit of a shot in the dark. Over 3 years ago, right after the start, I went on live television and debated no-fly zone with Lord Dannatt, who was the former head of the British Army. I think I probably lost the debate. I was also involved in an advocacy group at the time, very broad, and involving some senior Ukrainians and other people to advocate strongly for a no-fly zone. We lost that battle very, very quickly. The United States has absolutely no problem, nor does Britain, in shooting down missiles fired at Israel from Iran or the Houthis or whoever. So I will put forward one thing, and I know it is problematic because I've discussed this with some of my senior military friends, but the one thing that I would propose is a no-fly zone at least over the western part of Ukraine, west of the Dnipro, and ideally over all of Ukraine. That could at least defend Ukrainian cities from the murderous missile attacks which they suffer from, the most horrendous recent one being Sunni. That's my for what it's worth.
One more question, please.
Do you see in any European country policy moves trying to separate principle of freedom of speech from the principle of foreign propaganda and interference? It's a simple question. I think it's extremely important.
I think that's a brilliant question, if I may. I'm sure we've all probably got things to say on this.
I think we should just...
Okay, that's an absolutely brilliant question. So J.D. Vance has just announced, as has Rubio, that they are going to shut down the main institution in the United States that has been working against disinformation coming out of China and out of Russia. We are all going to feel the consequences of that. Okay? This is going to shape your social media. This is going to shape the information, particularly that Americans are going to see, because I can guarantee, as they have been throughout the entire war, China and Russia are going to flood, as a consequence of this, even further, all sorts of different information avenues. Unfortunately, too many people are unable to distinguish, to your point, because of ideological reasons, the difference between what they call as freedom of speech, or absolute freedom of speech, and a prevention of deliberately designed disinformation. Disinformation is information that is designed to mislead you by intent. That is different from blocking somebody who holds a legitimate opinion that is theirs, that they have formed through various different conversations, articles, videos. Because perhaps of overreach by states during the pandemic, there has been a response and an overreaction in many countries to thinking that freedom of speech means that actually you have to also protect the avenues of disinformation. They are separate things. They have to be treated as such, just as they were during the Cold War. But unfortunately, again, because of historical ignorance, too many leaders, I'd say, particularly on the other side of the pond, cannot distinguish between those two things. And if I'm to give Musk any credit in this argument, because I'm really attacking men like Elon Musk, he believes, I think, that over the long term, the truth outs itself, that people learn what is true and untrue because the lies, as it were, are exposed. But we don't have that time. We don't have that luxury of time of learning from mistakes, because those mistakes could end us up in another major global confrontation. So we should all be prioritising combating disinformation. And I credit Jonathan, I credit everybody at this panel, and many of you in this room who battle that specifically.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. I think it was a very passionate debate this evening. And why was it passionate? Because Ukraine matters to every single one of us. and that's why we're passionate. We want Ukraine to succeed, and we want Ukraine to be victorious. And you absolutely can get involved with things. So at the moment, there is a petition online on change.org about Netrebko. I've put together a letter which was signed by the Ukrainian community to the Royal Opera House, and it cited why she shouldn't be there. We are going to continue with that campaign, and we're going to write to the Secretary of State. We don't stop there. So we are doing things. And if you want to get involved, please come to Downing Street. We are there twice a week. If you want to be involved in things, that is the centre of power in Whitehall. We're there on a Wednesday. We're there on a Sunday. So get involved. We need as many of you as possible. And on that note, Slava Ukraini! Slava Nazi! Ukraina! 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 And I'll just leave Jonathan to round things up.
I want to thank all the voices on the panel today. People who've come here at their own time, their own expense to do this. We're massively grateful to everyone, as well as the audience. And also a small disclaimer. We did approach numerous Ukrainian experts just because of the timing, because it's Good Friday. We couldn't get somebody who was available. A lot of people are abroad and with their families. But we did approach many Ukrainian experts. Many of them were female. We are entirely mindful that every panel, and it's my view, every panel where we can, should include, I'd aim for 50% Ukrainian voices, not just because they're Ukrainian, it's because they have the strongest views, the strongest insights into what's going on, and the historical understanding of the context as well. So that's just a small disclaimer there for our audience, but I'm massively grateful to everyone who has come along. And watch this space, we'll be doing more events. This one was about Europe, Europe on fire, why we need to fight back against Russian aggression. We do many other episodes, including ones about Russian soft power, Russian culture, and the pernicious effect it has throughout Western Europe. So watch this space, more events to come. Thank you.